What if the reason you've always felt too different, too intense, too emotionally aware isn't a flaw at all, but a rare psychological and spiritual wiring that only a few people on this planet carry? And what if that very difference makes you one of the most misunderstood yet powerful empathic beings in existence? One of the most defining experiences of a Heyoka empath is the inability to remain emotionally neutral in the presence of others. It is not a conscious decision nor a learned behavior. It happens automatically, almost like a silent internal reaction that precedes thought. When such a person enters a space, something subtle begins to shift within them. They may feel fine moments before, but suddenly, without any clear external reason, their emotional state begins to mirror the atmosphere around them. If the room carries tension, their body becomes restless. If there is sadness present, even unspoken, they may feel an unexpected heaviness in their chest or a quiet emotional fatigue that does not belong to their personal life. This absorption of emotional energy is not limited to close relationships. It can occur in public spaces, workplaces, or even through digital interactions where emotional tone is conveyed indirectly. A Heyoka empath often senses the emotional undercurrent behind words rather than the words themselves. A simple conversation that appears normal on the surface can leave them feeling emotionally drained if there is hidden frustration or sadness beneath it. They do not need explicit expression from others. Their sensitivity operates on a subtler layer of perception that registers what is not being said. Over time, this creates a complex internal landscape. The boundary between self and others becomes less rigid, and emotional experiences can feel intertwined. At times, they may struggle to distinguish whether a feeling originates from their own life or has been absorbed from someone else. This can lead to moments of confusion, where emotions appear suddenly without context, as if they have entered the system from an external source. In such moments, introspection becomes essential, as they slowly learn to trace the origin of what they feel, separating inherited emotional states from personal truth. This heightened sensitivity also means they are often deeply affected by the emotional state of those they care about. When someone close to them is in pain, they do not simply empathize in a distant way, they experience a reflection of that pain within themselves. This can create emotional exhaustion, especially when they are surrounded by individuals who are struggling but unable or unwilling to express it openly. Their presence becomes a kind of emotional receiver, constantly interpreting and processing layers of feeling that others may not even be aware they are projecting. Yet, within this sensitivity lies a profound depth of awareness. Because they are constantly exposed to emotional realities beneath the surface, they develop an intuitive understanding of human nature that is difficult to articulate. They begin to notice patterns in emotional expression, subtle shifts in tone, body language, and energy that reveal more than spoken communication ever could. This awareness is not analytical in the traditional sense. It is instinctive, arising from repeated exposure to emotional truth in its rawest form. However, this gift also carries a burden. Without conscious grounding, they may become overwhelmed by the emotional weight they carry from others. Moments of solitude often become necessary, not as isolation, but as a form of emotional recalibration. In silence, away from external influences, they slowly begin to distinguish what belongs to them and what does not. This process is not immediate or effortless. It is gradual, requiring patience and inner observation. Over time, they learn that emotional absorption is not something to eliminate, but something to understand, regulate, and transform into awareness that deepens their perception of life itself. A Heyoka empath carries a very unusual psychological and emotional dynamic. They function as a living mirror for the hidden layers of other people's inner world. This mirroring is not intentional and it is rarely controlled. It happens through presence alone, When they interact with others, something subtle but undeniable begins to surface in the people around them. Behaviors, beliefs, and emotional patterns that are usually well hidden or carefully managed begin to reveal themselves, often without the person realizing why they suddenly feel exposed or emotionally unsettled. This phenomenon does not come from judgment or confrontation. In fact, Heyoka empaths are often not trying to analyze or challenge anyone. The mirroring effect occurs naturally because of their heightened emotional sensitivity and intuitive perception. They are able to sense inconsistencies between what people say and what they actually feel. They pick up on contradictions between outward expression and internal truth, and this awareness creates a reflective field around them in which others begin to unconsciously see themselves more clearly than they are used to. For many people, this experience can feel deeply uncomfortable. It is not that the Heyoka empath points out flaws directly, but rather that their presence brings hidden emotions to the surface. Someone who is suppressing frustration may suddenly feel irritated in their presence. A person avoiding grief may unexpectedly become emotional without knowing why. This happens because the empathic field disrupts emotional suppression, allowing what is buried beneath awareness to rise closer to the surface. It is as if the emotional mask people wear becomes thinner in their presence, even without any words being exchanged. This mirroring effect often creates a paradox in relationships. Some individuals feel an immediate sense of connection and authenticity around a Heyoka empath, as if they can finally be seen without effort. Others, however, may feel defensive or uneasy, sensing that something within them is being reflected back that they are not ready to acknowledge. This can lead to polarized reactions, deep trust and openness on one side, and avoidance or emotional resistance on the other. The empath becomes a catalyst for emotional truth, whether it is welcomed or resisted. In everyday life, this can manifest in subtle yet powerful ways. Conversations may take unexpected turns, revealing emotional undercurrents that were not initially visible. People may begin sharing more than they intended, not because they were pressured, but because the emotional environment feels unusually honest. At times, even silence becomes revealing, as unspoken thoughts seem to become more noticeable in the shared space. The Heyoka empath does not need to ask deep questions. Their presence alone often invites deeper responses from others. This mirroring quality can also extend to social environments. In group settings, they may unconsciously shift the emotional tone of the room. Hidden tensions become more apparent. Unresolved conflicts may surface indirectly, and group dynamics that were previously balanced on superficial agreement may begin to reveal underlying instability. This is not because they disrupt intentionally, but because emotional authenticity becomes more difficult to maintain in their presence. Over time, this role of emotional reflection can become both enlightening and challenging. It allows them to see humanity with unusual clarity, understanding the complexity behind human behavior without relying on surface interpretations. At the same time, it can lead to misunderstandings, as people may project their own discomfort onto the empath, assuming that they are the source of emotional disruption rather than the mirror reflecting what already exists within them. A Heyoka empath often carries an internal experience of reality that does not align with the rhythm of ordinary social environments. While others engage comfortably in surface-level communication, routine exchanges, and socially accepted patterns of conversation, the Heyoka empath tends to experience these interactions as incomplete or emotionally thin. There is an internal sense that something essential is missing from most daily exchanges, even when everything appears perfectly normal on the outside. This creates a quiet but persistent feeling of separation, not necessarily from people physically, but from the depth of connection that the empath naturally seeks and perceives as meaningful. In everyday environments, conversations are often built around practical matters, light storytelling, or socially convenient expressions. For most people, this is enough to maintain connection. For a Heyoka empath, however, there is an instinctive awareness of the emotional layers beneath these conversations. They do not only hear words, they sense intention, emotional tone, and unspoken meaning. This constant perception of deeper undercurrents makes it difficult for them to fully engage in interactions that remain on the surface. As a result, they may appear quiet, detached, or introspective in group settings, not because they lack interest, but because their attention is naturally drawn to what is not being openly expressed. This difference in perception often leads to misunderstandings. Others may interpret their silence as disinterest or their depth as intensity that feels unusual or difficult to relate to. In reality, the Heyoka empath is often fully engaged, but in a dimension of interaction that is not immediately visible. While others exchange words, they are processing emotional subtext, observing subtle shifts in behavior, and intuitively analyzing the emotional atmosphere of the environment. This creates a form of internal dialogue that runs parallel to external conversation, making ordinary social engagement feel layered and complex. Over time, this experience can create a sense of emotional isolation. Even in the presence of friends, family, or colleagues, the Heyoka empath may feel as though they are operating on a slightly different wavelength. It is not necessarily loneliness in the traditional sense, but rather a feeling of being emotionally out of sync with the dominant rhythm of social interaction. They may find themselves longing for deeper conversations, more authentic exchanges, and environments where emotional honesty is not only accepted but naturally present. When such environments are absent, they adapt outwardly while maintaining an internal sense of distance. This misunderstanding is not limited to communication style. It also extends to emotional expression. Because Heyoka empaths experience emotions with greater intensity and complexity, their responses to situations may appear unusual to those who process emotions more simply or directly. Something that seems minor to others may feel deeply significant to them, while situations that are socially expected to be emotionally charged may not affect them in the same predictable way. This difference in emotional calibration can lead to confusion in relationships, where their reactions are sometimes misinterpreted or questioned. Despite this, there is also a hidden strength within this experience of being misunderstood. It forces the Heyoka empath to develop a strong inner world, one that does not rely entirely on external validation or social confirmation. They begin to trust their own perception of reality even when it is not immediately understood by others. This internal trust becomes a stabilizing force, allowing them to navigate environments that feel emotionally mismatched without losing their sense of identity. Over time, this builds resilience in a quiet form, where understanding oneself becomes more important than being fully understood by everyone around them. For a Heyoka empath, emotional understanding rarely arrives in a straight or predictable line. Instead, it often begins with a phase of inner turbulence that can feel confusing, contradictory, and even overwhelming. When a situation arises that carries emotional weight, their internal response is not immediate clarity, but a wave of mixed sensations that seem to pull in different directions at once. Thoughts, feelings, and intuitive impressions overlap, creating a temporary state where nothing feels fully settled or defined. This is not a malfunction of perception, but rather a deeper processing system that requires movement through complexity before arriving at meaning. In this stage, emotions do not present themselves in neat categories. Sadness may coexist with anger, empathy may blend with discomfort, and understanding may be temporarily clouded by emotional intensity. The Heyoka empath often feels as though they are standing inside an emotional storm, where every feeling is present at the same time and none of them are fully separated. This internal experience can make it difficult to explain what is happening to others, because from the outside there may be no visible reason for such intensity. Yet internally, the emotional system is actively working through layers that are not immediately accessible to conscious thought. This chaos is often triggered not only by personal experiences, but also by external emotional environments. Because of their sensitivity, they absorb emotional signals from people and situations around them, which adds additional layers to their internal state. When multiple emotional inputs are present, the mind does not filter them out immediately. Instead, it holds them together, allowing them to interact and conflict internally. This creates a period of emotional saturation where clarity feels distant, even though processing is actively taking place beneath the surface. During this phase, the Heyoka empath may question their own reactions. They may wonder why they feel so strongly, why their emotions seem inconsistent, or why certain experiences linger longer than expected. This questioning is part of the internal attempt to organize emotional information that has not yet been structured into understanding. It is a form of mental and emotional sorting, where the mind slowly begins to identify patterns within what initially feels chaotic. However, this process cannot be rushed, because clarity for them is not immediate insight but the result of gradual internal alignment. As time passes, something subtle begins to shift. The intensity that once felt overwhelming starts to reorganize itself. Emotional fragments begin to connect, and what once felt scattered starts forming a coherent internal picture. This transition is not sudden, but it is noticeable. Thoughts that were previously disconnected begin to align with feelings, and emotional contradictions begin to resolve into a deeper understanding. What was once confusion starts transforming into insight, often arriving in moments of quiet reflection rather than active analysis. This transformation from chaos to clarity is one of the defining rhythms of their emotional life. It repeats itself in different forms throughout their experiences, each time refining their ability to understand both themselves and others. The chaos is not an obstacle to clarity. It is the pathway through which deeper awareness is formed. Without entering this state of emotional complexity, the level of understanding they eventually reach would not be possible. The process requires patience with internal discomfort, as well as the willingness to remain present within emotional uncertainty without immediately escaping it. Over time, this cycle becomes familiar. The Heyoka empath begins to recognize that emotional confusion is not a sign of being lost, but a stage of deeper processing. They learn that clarity always arrives, but only after they have fully experienced the emotional layers involved. This understanding gradually changes their relationship with uncertainty itself, allowing them to remain within complex emotional states without fear, knowing that beneath the turbulence there is an unfolding order that becomes visible only after the experience has fully matured internally. A Heyoka empath often moves through life in a way that unintentionally disturbs the fragile structures people build to maintain emotional comfort. These structures are not always dishonest in an obvious sense. They are often subtle psychological arrangements that allow individuals to avoid discomfort, suppress difficult truths, or maintain a sense of control over their internal world. The Heyoka empath, through presence alone, has a way of interacting with these structures that causes them to loosen. It is not a deliberate act of confrontation, nor a conscious effort to expose others, but rather an automatic consequence of heightened perception and emotional authenticity. This tendency begins with an inability to fully accept emotional distortion, even when it is socially normalized. Where others may overlook inconsistencies between words and behavior, the Heyoka empath instinctively notices them. They sense when someone is speaking from a place that does not align with their internal emotional state. This awareness creates an internal pressure toward truth, not in a moralistic sense, but as a natural alignment with what feels real. As a result, environments that depend heavily on appearances, superficial harmony, or unspoken avoidance of deeper issues often become unstable in their presence. The disruption of illusion does not always appear dramatic. In many cases, it manifests through simple presence, questions, or reactions that unintentionally reveal what has been avoided. A casual remark may highlight a contradiction that others prefer not to acknowledge. A neutral observation may bring attention to emotional undercurrents that were previously unspoken. Even silence from the Heyoka empath can create discomfort in environments where unexamined assumptions are quietly maintained. This happens because their presence subtly shifts attention from surface-level interaction to deeper emotional reality. In relationships, this dynamic can be particularly complex. People who are accustomed to maintaining emotional distance or controlled versions of themselves may feel unexpectedly exposed in the presence of a Heyoka empath. This does not necessarily mean that personal secrets are revealed, but rather that emotional defenses become less effective. Individuals may begin to notice their own inconsistencies, suppressed emotions, or unresolved tensions more clearly when interacting with someone who does not reinforce illusion through denial or avoidance. This experience can feel both enlightening and unsettling, depending on the individual's readiness to face themselves honestly. Within group settings, this effect becomes even more noticeable. Social dynamics often rely on shared assumptions, unspoken agreements, and collective avoidance of discomfort. When a Heyoka empath enters such an environment, these subtle agreements can become more visible. Tensions that were previously ignored may begin to surface indirectly. Roles that people unconsciously adopt within the group may become more apparent. Even minor contradictions in communication or behavior may stand out more clearly than usual. The empath does not intentionally disrupt these dynamics, but their sensitivity to emotional truth naturally brings them into focus. This disruption is not rooted in opposition, but in transparency. The Heyoka empath does not typically seek to challenge systems or beliefs for the sake of conflict. Instead, they exist in a state of alignment with what feels emotionally authentic, and this alignment often contrasts with environments built on emotional avoidance. As a result, they may be perceived as disruptive, even when their intention is not to disturb, but simply to be present in a way that does not filter or suppress emotional reality. Over time, this pattern can lead to mixed responses from others. Some individuals are drawn to the clarity that emerges in their presence, finding it refreshing and revealing. Others may feel discomfort or resistance, as the dissolution of illusion can temporarily destabilize their sense of emotional equilibrium. This dual response creates a complex social experience for the Heyoka empath, where they are simultaneously seen as clarifying and unsettling, grounding and destabilizing, depending on the emotional readiness of those they interact with. A Heyoka empath carries a very distinct relationship with emotional pain, one that does not rely on avoidance as the primary response. Instead of immediately pushing discomfort away or attempting to suppress it, there is often an unconscious tendency to stay with it long enough for it to be understood. This does not mean they enjoy suffering or seek it out, but rather that their internal processing system does not allow pain to remain superficial. It is experienced deeply, examined internally, and gradually translated into something more meaningful than the original sensation. Over time, this creates a pattern where emotional pain becomes a gateway rather than a destination, a temporary state that eventually opens into awareness. In the early stages of life experiences, this process can feel overwhelming. Emotional wounds may not pass quickly, and situations that others seem to recover from with relative ease may linger internally for a longer period. The Heyoka empath does not simply move on from emotional impact. Instead, they revisit it internally, often unconsciously, from different emotional angles. This repeated internal engagement allows them to extract layers of meaning that are not immediately visible on the surface of the experience. What initially appears as emotional heaviness slowly becomes a complex internal reflection where memory, feeling, and understanding begin to merge. This transformation does not happen in a linear or predictable way. There are periods where pain feels heavy and unresolved, followed by moments where sudden clarity emerges without warning. These insights often arrive during quiet moments when the mind is not actively trying to solve anything. Instead of forcing understanding, it appears naturally as a result of prolonged internal processing. A situation that once felt confusing or deeply painful may suddenly reveal its structure, purpose, or emotional lesson in a way that feels complete, even if it cannot be fully explained to others. As this pattern repeats over time, the Heyoka empath begins to develop a different relationship with suffering. Pain is no longer seen solely as something negative or purely destructive. Instead, it becomes part of a larger internal system of growth and awareness. Emotional experiences that were once overwhelming begin to feel like raw material for deeper understanding. This does not reduce the intensity of feeling, but it changes the interpretation of what that intensity means. Emotional depth becomes something that shapes perception rather than something that only disrupts it. This transformation also affects how they perceive other people's pain. Because they have experienced the internal process of turning emotional suffering into awareness, they often recognize similar patterns in others. They can sense when someone is in the early stage of emotional processing, still within confusion or resistance, and when someone is beginning to move toward understanding. However, they rarely impose this awareness on others directly. Instead, they observe, understand, and sometimes silently relate, knowing that each person must move through their own internal process in their own time. There is also an important internal consequence of this pattern. Over time, the Heyoka empath may develop a quiet form of resilience that is not based on emotional hardness, but on familiarity with emotional depth. Difficult experiences lose some of their destabilizing power, not because they are felt less, but because they are understood as part of a repeating cycle. Pain arrives, is felt fully, and eventually transforms into insight. This repeated cycle creates a stable inner foundation that is less dependent on external conditions and more rooted in internal awareness. Even in moments of significant emotional difficulty, there is often a subtle awareness that the experience is not static. Beneath the surface of distress, the mind continues to work, connecting emotional fragments, reinterpreting memories, and gradually building a deeper understanding. This ongoing transformation becomes a quiet background process, shaping how life is experienced at a fundamental level. Emotional pain, instead of remaining as a fixed burden, becomes something that moves through stages of meaning, gradually reshaping perception, awareness, and inner clarity